All right, guys, I hope you're ready. I'm excited for this one. But before we begin, you're gonna need to head on over to willgibbons.com/downloads, pop your email address in here and click submit. That gets you into the file vault, and then from there you can download your project files. I have my project files right here on screen, and we're gonna begin by importing our step file. This is mgm8 level.step. You're gonna drag this right on into KeyShot, and we're gonna take the default import settings. Now, if you're new to Material Graph Monday, welcome. And let me tell you, this is where I release a new video every Monday, and I walk you through how to create materials using KeyShot. So make sure you subscribe down below to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. All right, so now that our model's been imported, I wanna take you through the reference photo that I've included for you as well. So this is what we're gonna be using here. So we're gonna be trying to match this as close as we can. We'll see how we do. So first thing, we're going to go into our environments. Make sure you find the 3 panels straight 4K. And this one time, we're gonna use actually 3 panels tilted 4K. Double click on that. We're going to hit C on the keyboard to go to a white background. Go to our scene tree, and I want to explain how this model's been built really quickly. So we have those 2 screws, we'll turn those off. And then if we look inside, we have the level vial that's inside this assembly. So if I turn off housing top, you'll see the vial inside, and the vial holds some water. So I'm gonna turn this off. We'll come back to that. And then now we're looking at the housing bottom, which just has this plastic piece, and it's in 2 separate pieces because here we have a cloudy plastic and then like a clear plastic. Just like you can see on the reference photo here, you actually have this clear looking glass or plastic with no cloudiness, and then around it, the cloudiness stuff. So I wanted to do these in separate watertight objects to get the best results. So first thing we're gonna do, we're actually gonna hide this bottom part and turn on the top and just focus on this guy here. Double click the yellow. We're gonna go down to change this into solid glass, just quick and easy. And let's change it to the color white. Now you'll notice these lines. We're getting these lines because the edge of this disc is right up against the edge of this object here. That means the surfaces are coplanar. I could have modeled it with a bit of a gap, but I wanted to show you guys what would happen if you did not model with a gap, or if somebody gave you a model that was set up this way. The way we can fix this in KeyShot, because this is a symmetrical object, is we can go into our scene tree, find glass top or glossy top. We're gonna go down to its position underneath the scene tree. And for its scale, I want you to type in 0.999 and hit enter. And that scales it in just a little so those are no longer coplanar. Now we're gonna hide this central piece. Control-Alt, left-click to hide this center part, and double-click on this cloudy plastic object. Now we're pretty much gonna focus on this for the rest of the time. We're gonna change our material type from diffuse using this drop-down on the right, all the way down to plastic cloudy. And right away, it looks almost like a bit of a hazy glass. Now, in order to best understand how this material works, I'm going to be changing the color of my background a little bit. If we have a white background, it's going to help keep the color of this material as bright as possible. If we go to our environment settings on the right side, and then go under settings, find the background option, and change it from white to a very dark gray. You will now see that because we're seeing through our plastic material, the overall darkness of that plastic is more apparent. Double click on that plastic. We'll leave it with a dark background for now. Now I want to talk about a few of these properties. If we add a little bit of color, let's make our color, I'm going to choose a bit of a very light blue. And I want to keep my value all the way at 100%. Otherwise it will make the material much darker. So let's keep our value at 100%. We'll keep our saturation right where it's at. We'll call it 20%. Now we have this thing called transparency distance. This tells us, or lets us control, how far light has to move into this material before it matches the exact color we chose for our transmission value. So if we want this to look the same as this, well, I modeled this with a 1.5 millimeter wall thickness. So I would need to go and set this to 1.5 and hit enter. And now if our background was completely white, you would see that as this rendered up, if I let this render till completion, the actual color right here where my mouse is matching this exact color we chose here. Pretty cool. Now, if we go even lower, say 0.5, it just gets darker. So we're multiplying this color upon itself. If we take this up to 20, it does the opposite. It lightens it. But what's great is we get a little bit of color where the materials are the thickest. In my examples, I actually found that my best results came with a pretty high transparency distance. I believe somewhere around 20 when I did this the other day on my own. This is what I got directly out of KeyShot. And you'll notice it's a little on the darker side. And what we did in post is this. So this is where we're gonna end up with hopefully something looking like this. So in KeyShot versus post, there will be a bit of a difference, but again, I'll walk you through that in this tutorial. So if we want a little bit of blue, we could set this to be, you know, we'll call this 10% maybe. All right, now the next thing I wanna do is find the cloudiness value. So we have our plastic material walls, and then in between these walls is a scattering medium. Light enters and it bounces off of each of these particles and it diffuses, creating a soft glow within the material. We call this subsurface scattering. If we set this to 0.5, you'll notice we get more cloudy. And again, it's a little tough to see on this white background. So let's pop back into our environment settings, down to color, and set this more down to a darker gray, and back into our material settings. So if we take our cloudiness from 0.5 all the way up to 0.8, now we're gonna get all these little particulates that we can see. It looks much hazier. And you'll notice it starts looking pretty nice. The higher we go with our cloudiness, the more opaque it's going to look. Now, if we go down to our refractive index, generally you don't want to play with this value unless you know that you're changing it to another real world value. So we'll leave it at 1.4 for now. Roughness, of course, is what we use to make a surface less glossy. But watch what happens when I increase the roughness on this material. If I bring it up to 0.1, it might get a little bit darker. And actually, you know what? Before we go on any further, I want to go to our lighting presets because this is crucial. If you start working with complex materials like cloudy plastic and you're still in basic mode within your lighting presets, you're not gonna get the most realistic results. If I go down to product mode, it turns on the settings for the more complex calculations that are needed to make this material more realistic. Now, I will turn off ground illumination, which means we're not going to get the bouncing back light off the ground for now. And the rest of these we'll leave as they are. One other thing is interior mode, and I'll do a separate video on interior mode at some point, but one reason you may be tempted to use it is it does have a bit of a denoising algorithm inside there, so it helps smooth out materials. However, if I click on this, you may notice that this looks entirely different and it gets quite a bit darker. Now, this will brighten over time, but not nearly to the level at which we want it, so I think product mode is going to be your best bet for rendering this material. Now, let's talk about scattering directionality. Now, we can bias the light in KeyShot to either backscatter, coming back toward the camera, or forward scatter, moving directly through the material. Now, inside this book here, again, I did a little more reading on this topic. So you should notice that when you get to higher levels of front scattering or forward scattering in KeyShot, you're going to actually end up with a brighter looking material, a little more clarity, whereas backscattering is going to make it look a little bit hazier and more cloudy, so to speak. Here's what we're gonna do. If we take our scattering directionality and we say -0.8 and hit enter, we are basically backscattering this material. So we're having this scatter backwards, meaning back toward the camera after hitting the material and bouncing around inside there for a bit. Now, if we swap the negative with a positive and just delete this and hit enter, we will be forward scattering the material. And now it's going to create a bit of a different effect. You'll see much more of a clear plastic look instead of an opaque plastic look. I'm going to take my roughness back down to 0. Now, you might have noticed that this got lighter after I did that. If I take this up to say 0.9 or 0.95, which is a very high number here for scattering direction. And now I'll take my roughness up to 0.1 and see how this affects it. Maybe a little bit darker. Now, the other thing I want to do is, again, compare to bring this back down to 0. Let's compare this to backscattering, -0.95. You'll notice that now backscattering, it looks like this got quite a bit brighter, kind of brightened up. So we'll try 0.95 versus -0.95. And you'll notice it gets a lot brighter when we backscatter this to -0.95. Let's go ahead and try the roughness now. 0.1, and you'll notice we don't have those glossy reflections on the surface nearly as much. So there's a bit of a tour of these different properties. Now, getting this to look the way you want is literally just going to be a matter of playing with values. That said, I got a crazy idea and thought it would be cool to create some sort of reference guide for this material. And it's taken a minute to load because it's a very large image. I think this is 12,000 pixels wide, maybe. What I did is I rendered out a container with a hole in it at varying levels of cloudiness as well as backscattering and forward scattering. So my thought here was that if you were to find one of these you like, it's a little bit slow, but basically let's say you liked the way this one here looked. You would zoom out from there. You would go up and see the cloudiness is 0.9. And then if you went across, you could see the scattering direction is 0.4. And that would get you within the ballpark instead of having to test render a whole bunch of images, because it takes a while for this material to smooth out. Now, if that's not enough for you, I did another one, and this one goes in the opposite direction. This is negative, it goes from 0 to negative 0.98, so meaning it's backscattering. And you can see the effect that this has on the overall color or the saturation of the color within the material as well. So I'm hoping that these two documents or images help you kind of figure out roughly what you want your settings to be. This is looking pretty good. Also, I want to call out that this material is pretty slow. It's been sitting for quite a while on a pretty powerful machine. So don't be surprised if you have to wait a long time for this material to start looking. All right, so let's actually dive into getting this material to look like our reference photo. You'll see our reference photo has us looking more transparent than this looks right now. We also need to put a texture on there. I'm going to take my settings back down for now. I'll set them to 0 for my scattering direction, my roughness to 0, my cloudiness will say 0.5 or so. Go to textures, and then on bump, we'll right click, go down to textures and choose your noise fractal. Well, we'll go into the material graph for a second just to preview this. If we hit C to preview our noise fractal, it's very large at 10 millimeters. I brought mine down to 0.5 millimeters. So very, very small texture here in order to get the little bump pattern that matches the reference photo. So if I hit C to get out of that preview, now we'll notice that we have a nice textured look on this material. I'm going to take my scattering direction and probably increase it a little bit. Let's say 0.5. Still not helping. Let's try negative 0.5 and negative 0.8 and see if we like those different. So notice I'm not seeing much of a difference yet. And that comes down to this being a pretty thin material as well as my cloudiness not being that high yet. So let's take this from 0.5 up to 0.7 or 8. Yeah, let's try 0.8. That looks pretty good. And now this is still backscattering. If we go in the opposite direction, it looks a little bit more clear. Now, one thing that's missing is that this material right now is glossy. I know for a fact that my reference item is actually rough. It's got like a matte finish right around here. So I want to make sure I bring that roughness into this as well. So I'll take my roughness and I'll set this to 0.1, which is about correct. And now notice, I'll take it down to 0. This is a lot brighter and a lot nicer looking. Add a little roughness and it gets darker and more dull. Not something I'm particularly thrilled about. This is a function of energy conservation, or I guess lack thereof. I believe this is contributing to this appearance. So if you've ever added roughness to any dielectric material in KeyShot, so could be glass, could be metal, could be a cloudy plastic, you will have noticed that the surface generally will look darker when you add more roughness. Again, we want to get around that because in the real world, that doesn't actually happen. And if I look here at this chapter here, we have an excerpt from BRDF models for subsurface scattering. And this basically gets into what happens if you account for energy conservation or not when rendering rough dielectrics. You will end up getting a darker material if you're not calculating all the multiple bounces as light scatters across that very rough surface. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, within KeyShot, it does not account for those multiple scatters, but I do have a workaround, and I'm going to show you in Photoshop how we can use this workaround to make our materials look better despite this shortcoming. Okay, that's all for now. I also want to take a brief moment to call out a very, very helpful and really nice YouTube video in which Eric Heitz's research gets explained. So if you scroll to the bottom, there's this awesome YouTube video by 2 Minute Papers, which has lots of helpful, interesting stuff related to rendering and science and visualization. Watch just the first minute of this video and you'll understand pretty well what's going on. I'll include the link so you can check this out. I think it's incredibly helpful and just a very interesting watch. Again, watch this video, this will explain it very well. Our material got darker when we added a little roughness, and again, I'm gonna show you how to fix that in Photoshop here in a bit. Now, if we take our scattering directionality and go in the opposite direction, negative 0.8, you'll see this is gonna give us a bit more of a hazy appearance. I'll take a moment to say I'm going by eye on this. I don't know how to actually figure out if this material in real life does forward scatter or back scatter. I honestly don't know that. So sorry for not having all the answers, but so at this point, I'm thinking this is pretty close within the neighborhood of what I want. If I wanted a little more color in here, we could always take this saturation up. We can maybe go up to 15%, a little more blue. One other interesting thing, if we go into our environment and change our background color to white or close to white again, this is where you're really going to notice how dark this material actually looks. I will say some of the dark areas of this material are coming from our environment. Notice our environment has black and dark gray in it. If our environment was brighter, say 2, you'll see the material gets a lot brighter. Also gets too bright, so we have to be conscious of this. I'll go back down to 1 for now. And back to that material, not to beat a dead horse, but if we take our roughness down to 0, you'll notice the material gets a little bit brighter and has a little more clarity as well. But let's go ahead and set this back to 0.1. And I think we've spent enough time talking about this material. My whole goal here was just to explain this to you and make sure you really understood what playing with these settings actually did. Now we're gonna go back to our scene, and if we turn on the glossy top, we'll see that we have this plastic piece that goes with inside. If we go and grab the same color that we used within our cloudy plastic, and we drag that swatch down here to reuse it, we can go to the plastic centerpiece and use that same color there. And we can make sure that this is transparency distance is also set to 20 to match the object around it as well. Let's go ahead and worry about the little guy in the middle. So if we turn on our level vial, we're going to set it to a solid glass, and we're going to make this the color white. And then we're going to hide it with Control Alt left click. Now this this liquid, we're going to change it from diffuse down to a liquid material, and we're going to set the refractive index outside, this right here. We're gonna set this to 1.5, and we're gonna set the refractive index to 1.3, because I'm gonna call this basically water, which has an index of refraction of 1.3. And the reason we set this other one to 1.5 is because this needs to match the tube, the glass tube that it's inside, this one right here. Because the way this was modeled is that liquid tube with the bubble is actually protruding into the walls of this glass cylinder. Some of the refraction gives us a lot of darkness in here, especially on these round objects. When we go to do our rendering in our lighting tab, this ray bounces actually has a very big impact on how these transparent materials look. If I take this from 14 up to 28, so I double it, notice how much brighter this gets. This gets rid of those black voids. We basically want to make sure before we do our final rendering that our ray bounces is high enough in order to make sure we don't have any of these black pockets. If I double this again to 56, you'll notice all the black goes away. This will mean a lot longer render times, but generally I crank those up a little bit when I'm doing complex transparent materials like this. Now, if I go back to our material and I want to darken this, we can take our 10 millimeters for our transparency distance and bring it down to say maybe 0.2. Now I want to go and make sure that we finish this guy off. So I'll turn on the screws, and the screws are going to be pretty basic. We'll just search for, within our materials, we'll search for a hard, shiny black plastic, and we'll throw those on the screws. Maybe add a tiny bit of roughness. So say 0.05, good enough. And then we'll turn on our housing top, and we'll turn on our housing bottom, which has the same materials because those were linked, those parts. I also want to make sure that things are looking lit well. And this is one that I'm not going to walk you guys through because this tutorial is already running pretty long. So I will leave it up to you to set up your lighting, which does have a pretty big impact on how this material looks. I will tell you, if you want to stay away from noise, don't use area lights in here. Just use your HDRI editor. This is not just for quick, dirty renderings. The HDRI editor can make things look really nice. Also, I'm seeing some interference, some coplanar surfaces down below where that other disc is actually affecting or coming up against the other part. So let's take this circle, this glossy bottom part, and set the scale to 0.999. Overall, we're looking pretty good. Now, notice it's dark inside here. We go back to our render settings, and we turn on ground illumination. Now we're going to let light go into this object, which is going to help us make sure that we're not casting unnecessarily dark shadows underneath our part. That's another thing you have to consider here. Now, I'm just going to use a dark background and a ground plane to finish this off. I'm going to hit Control G to add a ground plane. Notice it gets fuzzier. Double click that ground plane, or at least I'm going to change it to just diffuse for now. Very cool. And now I'm going to rotate my environment so I get a little light on the surface. So I'll hold Control and I'll left click drag. And this rotates our environment around. And you'll see if you move it carefully and slowly, you can get the reflection from one of these panels in the top surface here. Nice and easy. Very, very quick. And you just got to be careful to kind of position your camera so that looks the way you want it. And lastly, I try to bring the material to be as bright as I can before I render this. So what I did is I actually customized this HDRI before I was done. So you could go to your HDRI editor and I can turn off some of these lights I don't need and figure out which ones are really contributing. This one definitely is. I'll take this guy and make it brighter, say maybe 3. And then this other one, find out where this one's coming from. This one's coming from the right side. So what I could do to make some variation is we could scale this guy down and then make it a lot brighter, like 10 maybe. Notice the jagged reflection. That's because we're in low resolution preview mode within our HDRI editor. This little button here tells us we need to generate the full res version. And what I'm gonna do, I'll go an extra step to make sure this is a nice crispy edge. Go click on background under all those pins, set the resolution to 10,000 by 5,000, then refresh to get the full res. And now that edge will be crystal clear, very sharp, and your shadows will also not be jagged or pixelated either. All right, I'm gonna take my overall brightness of my environment, make it a little bit brighter, 1.5 maybe, and 1.2. And at this point, this is where we're basically going to pause it. I did do a rendering last night. I followed all these same steps, but some of my figures might have been a little different. I played around with the HDRI a little more, and I put a different ground material down. The ground material I downloaded was some textures from polygon.com, POLIIGON.com. It was some free wooden texture there, so you can check that out if you want. The last thing I'm gonna call out here is I'm seeing some very sharp edges on these screws and some other things here. So if we want to add rounded edges to this model, click on the top level, go down to properties and find the rounded edges and have the radius, let's just do 0.1. 0.1 is probably fine. And that's gonna round those edges to give you more realism. You're gonna, depending on your computer, have to let this render for quite some time. So make sure you're happy with it before you let it render. And then honestly, I left mine rendering pretty much overnight for a high res 1920 by 1920. Also, within your render settings, I will call this out. Your best solution, or what I recommend, is in your options, set maximum samples, not maximum time. I let the example I'm going to walk you guys through in Photoshop next, I let mine render to 1500 samples. If you want it to be even more smooth looking and less grainy, also I rendered out a 1920 by 1920 for the example I'm gonna show you. And if you wanna follow along, what I recommend you do is render out a PSD 16-bit. This is if you have Photoshop. If you have another program to do your photo editing in, not Photoshop, maybe try EXR instead. Now, the other thing that's nice about PSD, Photoshop document, is you can get extra render passes if you want. So I rendered out a clown pass, and I recommend we do a refraction pass, which is and if you want any of these, go ahead and click them, but they don't take any longer to render, so that's good to know. Finally, choose add to PSD, so that way you get a layered Photoshop file, and then I would hit render. So I'll just hit add to queue now, and this is where we're gonna pop into Photoshop, and I'm basically going to walk you through the finishing steps to go from something that looked like this out of KeyShot to this when I was done with it in Photoshop. Okay guys, we are now in Photoshop. Here we're looking at a 16-bit file, which is important. That gives us more control over the brights and darks within this image. Now I've got my RGB layer. This is what KeyShot created. If you create some render passes like I recommended, you'll get a folder called render passes here. And inside that, what came with mine was a clown pass. So this is good for making selections if you want to affect just one of these materials here. I also output a refraction pass, which looks like this. So this is all the light that's being refracted through these materials, these transparent glass or dielectric materials here. This is what I like to use to kind of brighten my overall cloudy plastic images when I'm done rendering. And notice it ignores the materials that wouldn't have light refracting through them. So the screws are ignored, things like that. Now, if we take our RGB pass, which is our final image that KeyShot created, it looks okay, but again, in my reference photo, it looks a lot brighter and a little more clear. And in my final rendering here, it looks a little more dark and a little more gray than I wanted it to. So to improve that, what I did is I took my refraction pass And if I turn it on, you'll see it looks good. That's because this is the refraction pass. If you set your blend mode from normal to screen, what it does is it takes the black pixels or the dark pixels and it ignores those, and it takes these light color pixels and it increases the brightness of everything below it. So we go from normal to screen, and now a world of difference. If I turn that on and off, look at that. And that's really all you need to do. Like for me, that's quick and dirty. Like that's what I want to do. That's what I want out of a cloudy plastic material. But if you want to go a little bit further, like I did, I actually duplicated the refraction pass to create a bloom layer and to show you what that looks like on its own. So I duplicated it and then I did a Gaussian blur, I think something like 20 pixels or so, to really make it soft. And I set this to screen as well so that this would be layered on top of everything else. So you can see this is what the bloom layer does, and it just makes the whole thing glow, but it's a little bit too much. So I took my opacity down to 30%. So now I'll turn it on and off, so see if you can see a difference. It's very, very subtle. I didn't even end up using my clown pass. And then finally, to finish this off, I used what's called a lookup or a LUT. If I turn this on, you'll see the difference just kind of darkens the right side of the image. If we take our LUT and we set it to 100%, you can see it's a very heavy-handed effect. So I just took its opacity down to 50%. And these LUTs are built into Photoshop. If you go to adjustments and you click on this grid, and then you can play with these different built-in LUTs to see what kind of filters and effects they'll give you. And once you find one that you like, I suggest turning its opacity way down so it doesn't look too exaggerated. So when I was happy with all that, I basically flattened all those layers, which was Control-Shift-Alt-E to create this image or this layer on top. And notice my new image bulges out. Why the heck do I do that? KeyShot doesn't have a spherical lens distortion. It just has kind of a forced perspective. And when you take a photo with a lens, you'll notice the wider the lens and the closer to the object you get, the more of a bulge you get in the middle of the object. So I like to add this in post to make a more natural lens effect. So if I click on this layer, you can go to filter and then you go to lens correction. So from here, what I did is I went to custom and then this remove distortion. I took like a -6 or something and you see it bulged it out. That's how I got that bulging look. And last but not least, if you notice here, my texture wasn't showing up as much as I wanted it to. So what I did is I sharpened this a little bit and I just did it toward the front of the object to kind of create like a part of the camera that was in focus. So I took my sharpen tool here and I just brushed in a teeny little bit of sharpness here. And that's it. When all is said and done, I like this much better than this. To me, this is okay, but this looks like a finished image to me. So from there, I just saved it out as a JPEG. And this was rendered at 1920 by 1920. And on a powerful machine, it took a very long time to render. I don't know how long exactly, but just warning you, this material can be a little bit slow. But the results can be great once you know what to do with it. Whew. All right, guys, we did it. Couple things before I close out this video. One, if you follow along, make sure you share your image on Instagram and tag me at Will Gibbons Design, and I'll share your image. Two, if you go shopping anytime soon on Amazon, try to remember to use my links down below or go to willgibbons.com/Amazon and use that link there. Three, subscribe and like the video if this was helpful. Tell me if you like this video, comment down below. Let me know if this format was okay. Last but not least, if I don't get a video out next week, it's because I will have just returned from Square One conference up in San Francisco. I'm doing a workshop up there and I'm sure I'll be exhausted when I get back. So if you don't see a video from me next week, it's because I needed 1 week to get caught up. I also might have a big freelance project going on at that time too. So if you don't see me next week, I'll be back the following week with a video, guys. Anyway, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, happy rendering.